I am Betty Landauer-Menchik, Education Chair of the Lansing Area League of Women Voters. The League is known for promoting citizen participation, particularly through voting. The League also works to educate citizens on important topics and policies, including what we'll learn about today. Today's virtual luncheon is the second of a two-part series. Our January webinar gave members an idea of how online schooling works. Today's webinar will look at the research on the effectiveness of virtual schools. Does it work for all kids? Does it work better for some children than others? Are there successful models that can be replicated in Michigan? How can such schools be held accountable? We are pleased to welcome Professor Michael Barbour of Touro University California. Dr. Barbour has been involved with various forms of online education for decades, primarily as a researcher, but also in other roles. He's been a teacher, designed courses, and been an administrator. His research into online schooling has paid particular attention to students in rural areas. He has testified before state legislatures here and has consulted for ministries of education in Canada and in New Zealand. He will tell you what he has learned, but for us, the following quotation sums it up. Virtual schooling continues to expand, largely without effective oversight or regulation, despite the general lack of evidence that it is efficacious in most circumstances. Legislators and policymakers have consistently failed to pass bills or create regulatory regimes that would provide additional oversight and accountability to online schooling. Members of the Education Committee will be fielding your questions, and they will be addressed at the end of the presentation. Please send them via the Q&A. Dr. Barbour.
Sorry, I muted myself there. Thank you very much for that introduction. So I will jump right in and bring up my slides here. So I know there was a long list of questions there in the introduction. And while I'd like to say that there's research out there that I can provide you that will speak to all of those things, I'd probably be lying if I said that. Based on the research that's out there, I have answers to all of those questions, I think, based upon my experiences in the field over the last, I guess it's been 23 years now. Yes, this is all white down here for a reason. But anyway, so let's jump in. So I'm Mike Barbour from Touro University, California in lovely Vallejo. And Touro University actually sits out on Mare Island, on the former Mare Island Naval base. And in particular, it actually sits on land that was included as part of the 1851-1852 unratified treaties, specifically Treaty O, which dealt with tracts 295 and 296. And you can see the yellow dot there. That is where Touro is located in Solano County. And in particular, Touro is located on the unceded lands of the Karkan people, although the Solano County, which is where we're located, also is home to tribes of the Patwan and the Miwok as well. So let's get into this issue. The first thing I want to say is that distance education at the K-12 level has a long history, not just in small rural jurisdictions, although that tends to be where it has started. So if you look at the United States, we have distance education being used really for over a century now at the K-12 level, and for almost 130 years within the higher education setting. I mention that because obviously over the past, I guess it's 11 months now, we've gone through sort of a major transformation within the education system because of the pandemic that we've had. And unfortunately, we've all just focused really upon this last one here, you know, the online learning aspect of it. We haven't really leveraged some of these, what I would call legacy technologies, to do a better job of providing opportunity for students that aren't getting it right now. And that's sort of a theme that we have within the field. So if you look at online learning in particular at the K-12 level, we've been doing this now for about 30 years. So the first online programs in the US began in 1991 in California. A private school by the name of Laurel Springs was the first to start. You can see that starting in 94 and then continuing really up until 2001, you had a proliferation of public school programs that began to be offered. So everything from full-time programs were similar to the virtual charter schools that you would have heard about a month ago when you were attended the first of these sessions, to supplemental programs where students were enrolled in one or more courses online in order to supplement what they couldn't get or had difficulty accessing within their own schools. And you can see sort of the milestones that happen along that journey there. So the Keeping Pace report that you see in 2003 was actually titled Keeping Pace with K-12 Online Learning. And it looked at essentially what was happening on a state-by-state basis when it came to full-time and supplemental online learning, both the level of activity that was happening, as well as the nature of governance that was happening in each state. That report actually continues right up until about 2015, 2016, when it takes a couple of years off. And in the last couple of years, the last two in particular, 2019 and 2020, the Digital Learning Collaborative have revived that report, although they call it the Snapshot report now. So it's like Snapshot 2019, Snapshot 2020, but it still goes through and looks at the state of digital learning. When we talk about online learning, you've heard me already use these two terms here. We have supplemental programs and we have full-time programs. So supplemental programs are programs where the students are actually in a school. And in the case of Michigan, they are under the supervision of a mentor or on-site facilitator while they're being taught by an online teacher who is from the virtual school. And while they may be doing one or two courses in the online environment, the rest of their courses they're taking in the classroom. And obviously, you know, they've got parents and guardians at home. I shouldn't say obviously. In most cases, they have parents and guardians at home that are able to provide some level of support. Whereas the full-time model, and this is where the cyber charters come in that we heard about last time, those students don't go to a physical school at all. So they do 100% of their schooling from home. Now they still in theory interact with an online teacher, but you'll notice that the arrows there have the teacher interacting more with the parent than with the student. And that actually is sort of an accurate reflection of what often happens at the particularly elementary ages, where the parent interacts with the teacher much more than the student interacts with the teacher. I won't say it's the majority of the time, but much more than you would find in a supplemental online environment, and definitely much more than what you would find in a traditional brick and mortar or face-to-face setting. Now, I start off with this because you'd be surprised about how much of the literature in the field actually focuses upon trying to define things. Just the terms that you've heard me use already. You know, I've used the terms virtual school, cyber charter, virtual charter. Last time when we were here, we heard the guys from the Department of Education talking about, public academies and virtual public academies and the different nomenclature around how these things are termed. And that's actually been one of the things that's really made research within the field, both from the researcher standpoint, but in particular from the policymaker and legislator standpoint, difficult, because there hasn't been a standardized set of terms that have been used. So it has allowed some of the actors that work in this space, some of the stakeholders within the field of K-12 online learning, to leverage things that may not necessarily be examples of what they're trying to do in an effort to support what it is that they want to do. So looking at the field right now, if we were to sort of stop and basically K-12 online learning in one of those two forms exists in all 50 states. I'd argue that they exist in every state, although the way in which it exists will look very differently from state to state. There's at least 2 million students engaged in supplemental online programs. And I say at least 2 million because that's really an estimate. Those students, for the most part, unless you're in a state where the funding follows the student and they use a course choice model. So, in the case of Michigan, as an example, all of the students that are enrolled in the Michigan Virtual School, which is the largest supplemental program, they're not actually enrolled in the Michigan Virtual School. They're enrolled in their local school, and their local school contracts with the Michigan Virtual School to offer that one course to this one student. But at the end of the day, the transcript, the grade, all of those things are assigned by the local school. They're not assigned by the Michigan Virtual School. So for most supplemental programs, we don't have the ability to just go to the Department of Education and try to figure out exactly how many students there are. Oftentimes in their own reporting, they'll tell us that. But because so many districts are also setting up their own supplemental programs, and in some cases they're reporting it, in some cases they're not. So it's really difficult to determine. I've seen that figure in some of the literature listed as high as 10 million students. I feel from a researcher standpoint comfortable saying at least 2 million based upon the data that I've seen. And then we've got about 750,000 that are engaged in full-time programs. And while full-time programs in many instances are a little bit easier to track, that again varies from state to state and even district to district, depending on what's actually happening. And I'll provide a good example of that out of Missouri in a minute here now. So what does this all mean? And when you look at sort of, in the case of, I think what, based upon the previous presentation, the previous webinar that you've had, there's really a focus upon full-time programs, in particular, the virtual charter or cyber charter schools that exist in Michigan. And this is actually just a screenshot of one of the slides that the folks from one of the cyber charters provided. And it was a schedule of essentially what a student would be responsible for throughout the week, a kindergarten student in this particular school. And when you look at this, one of the things you sort of wonder to yourself is, well, what does that actually mean? I mean, I can see there's a schedule there. By the looks of it, there's, looks to be about 15 synchronous sessions there. I'm guessing they're broken up into half-hour blocks only because some of them meet on the half hour, and there's ones at 8:30 and 9 o'clock, so that would obviously be a half-hour session. But I don't, trying to figure out sort of what that looks like. Like if I was sitting and watching a student in their home, what would that look like? And one of the things, if you haven't had the opportunity, I'd strongly recommend that you take a quick look at the National Education Policy Center Virtual Schooling in the U.S. 2019 report, and the URL is there, and I'll have these slides available for you after the fact. And I note that we're being recorded as well. So my guess is this will probably be posted on the League's YouTube channel at some point. But there's a section in there that talks about the virtual school experience. It begins on page 52, and it goes through and sort of describes what this means. And it's interesting because that section specifically begins with this statement. And it's an important statement, and I won't read it word for word here. I'll allow you to just skim through it as you're going. But essentially what it says is that because so many of these programs and the vast majority of students that attend these programs attend one that is offered by a for-profit provider, we don't know much about them in much the same way that, Coke has been around for, decades and decades. I don't remember. I should know this because I went to the University of Georgia, so I went to, you know, the worldwide Coke place, and I should remember when it started. But you know, they've got a secret formula. You know, we don't know what the what is it, 11 herbs and spices that the Colonel has in KFC, because you know, these are corporate secrets. And in much the same way that they have corporate secrets, the for-profit providers that offer these kinds of programs have the same corporate secrets. And because of that, even though they are public schools, in many instances, they don't have the same level of disclosure that your neighborhood brick and mortar school has. And because of that, there's very little in the way of independent research out there on these programs, with the exception of publicly available data, things that the corporations provide directly themselves, or in many instances, you have folks that are really proponents of, or I'll use the term cheerleaders of, these programs that are doing, they'll term it research, but you know, if you think the program is great when you walk through the door, you have to ask, how independent is that research in the first place? Now, what we can tell is that, you know, when you look at these online programs, they will tell you that it sort of begins with, you know, so your enrollment in these online programs begins with the delivery of instructional materials. Now, these instructional materials both are things that you can physically use. So, you know, books and manipulatives that, you know, I can think, you know, math manipulatives as an example. You get, you know, this little circle thing, and then there's all these different ways to cut up the pie that you can use in there for when you're doing elementary level math, as an example. We would assume that they come with, you know, a computer and other peripheral devices. In many cases, they will have a reimbursement for the internet connection or some sort of hotspot for folks that are in rural areas. And those are the things that we would sort of just naturally assume happen. But that's not necessarily always the case. So one of the things that we've discovered, and oddly enough, legal action against these companies have been, and the districts that they partner with, have actually been one of the better sources of information for us. So in a court case that began in 2015, I was actually asked to be an expert witness on behalf of LW, who is a freshman student at this particular program that was offered by the St. Louis Public School District. And what we had essentially was the student was placed into an online program, but they weren't given a computer. They weren't given internet access. They weren't given a place to go and access the computer. When the parent asked about this, they were told that the child could go to the public library. Now, the public library for this child was about a 90-minute bus ride that involved 2 buses that they had to take in each direction. For the first few weeks that the student went there, every time he went to the library during school hours, he was kicked out because they thought he was being truant. And it took almost a month for the student to actually get a letter from the school to the library saying he could be there. And then when he showed up, he's only allowed on the computer for 2 hours or 1 hour at a time, and 2 hours total throughout the day. And for every 1 hour he spends on the computer, then he's got to get up and go away for an hour, because they've got this rotational thing, so you don't have people camping out on the computers. You know, so you've got a student that misses a month of school because he doesn't get any of the technology. And then when he does finally get a way to access the technology, and it's not the easiest way in the world to do it, he's limited to 2 hours on the technology a day. Now, compare that to the fact that, you know, most students spend about 5 hours a day in school. Granted, I'm sure there's probably textbooks and some other offline things that this student could do, but are there really 3 hours of offline things that this student can do every single day? As you look at some of the way in which this is set up. So let's assume that it's best case scenario. I've got my box that shows up. It's got my computer in it. I've got my peripherals. I've got my textbook and stuff like that. You know, so I can do all of this at home. I get my internet reimbursement and that kind of thing. Again, from a court case that came out of Wisconsin that was filed in 2006 and finally decided in 2008. The judge in his decision basically describes this as the model of instruction that is provided there. And as you can see, the level of interaction that the student has with the teacher is actually quite low. I'll point to a line here in the middle where it says, a parent is required to devote 4 to 5 hours per day to the student's education. First of all, it's probably actually good that we're having these kinds of conversations now, because many parents have had now 10 months experience. Well, I guess if you take away the 2 summer months, so 8 to 9 months of experience of having their students at home all the time. How many parents actually have 4 to 5 hours every day to devote to their child's education? And I think, that what you're seeing here in these kinds of models is that the parent is considered the primary instructional person. And the online programs really are there for, these small tutorials, short tutorials. But for the most part, they are purveyors or providers of an online curriculum. In the research, basically, some people have even suggested that students attending these virtual charter schools, while, from a legal standpoint, they are attending a public school, the reality is they're just homeschooled kids that have access, where the state is paying for access to an online curriculum and access to an on-demand tutor when the student chooses to use them or when the parent decides to engage with them. And the literature has actually been quite clear on that kind of model. And even when you look at the model that they put up for us in the last session, if you add this up here, let's assume again that each of those synchronous sessions are a half hour, which I think is a reasonable assumption. There's 15 of them there, which means that there's 7.5 hours of instruction throughout the week where the teacher is actually engaged with the student. Although you'll notice that the first half hour every day is a morning meeting. So there's not actually any instruction that's happening there. In most cases, what's happening during that morning meeting is the student is coordinating with, the teacher is coordinating with the student and their parent, or their learning coach is the specific term that is used within the industry. And I use the term industry very specifically here to figure out exactly where the student is. Now, if you look at the asynchronous list of stuff there are 5 math lessons that the parent needs to make sure that the student does. There are 5 handwriting lessons. There are 5 language skill lessons. There are 5 phonetics lessons. There are 2 art lessons, 2 science lessons, 2 literature and composition lessons, and 1 social studies lesson. I know there's the bar there that has the audio thing above it, so you can't see some of them there, but I was able to go back and take a look. So there's 27 asynchronous lessons that the parent or guardian is responsible for making sure that the student has done in the system. And if you look at it, basically it varies from 4 to 5 every single day that the parent must oversee their child for. So it becomes very easy if you've got these 4 or 5 lessons every day, plus you've got to sort of make sure that they're on the computer for those synchronous sessions to figure out where these 4 to 5 hours every day that the parent or guardian is supposed to spend in this environment. So a lot of the literature has focused upon trying to both define and understand what's happening here. And when you look at the research a little bit, it's actually been a little bit disappointing for the most part. And I say that because, if you look at these 2 literature reviews as an example, they concluded that much of the literature up until that point, and keep in mind that point, 2009, is 18 years after the first online program started in the US, that most of the literature was based upon personal experiences of those that were actually in the system. Some, I guess it's 15 years after the first online programs exist. Kerry Rice, and I love the language here, a paucity of research. And I always quote this one because it's just a nice term or phrase. a paucity of research exists when you're looking at high school students, and there's even less when you're looking at elementary school students. I had a group of doctoral students a number of years, actually 2 years ago, that from Brigham Young University that I worked with. And what we did was we looked at every single journal article that we could find that was focused upon K-12 online learning, beginning from 1994 when we found the first one that was written up until 2016, because we were doing the work in 2017 was when we first started the project. And there were roughly 300, and I think it's 356 is the exact number that we had found. And you can sort of see the trajectory of how many were done, published each year. But it's very interesting when you sort of look at where they're published. And the main thing that I take when I look at here is, while you've got those 10 there that are all publishing, say, 9 or 10 articles or more, and the fact that you've got one journal there, the Journal of Online Learning Research, that has published, since it started publishing in 2015, has actually published 25% of the research in the field. There were 132 journals that published 4 or fewer articles. There were 102 journals that only published a single article, which basically means that the readers of that article, the readers of that journal, the only thing that they know about K-12 online learning is what this one article told them, which also means that the reviewers of that article probably didn't have a strong background in the field, nor would the editors of that particular journal. And what that often means is you have things that get published under the guise of research and under the guise of peer-reviewed published research that really isn't all that good. In many cases, that if they had been submitted to one of these 10 that you see in the chart here, likely would have actually been turned down because of the fact that it overlooked so many things. And that goes for authors as well. So when we looked at those roughly 350 articles, there were 384 distinct authors, because oftentimes many journal articles are published by or written by not just one person, but many people. And what I want to point out, while there were 11 people that really published a lot of it, and as you can see there, of the 350, I was responsible for basically roughly 1 out of every 7 articles that were published in the field. The important thing to note there is that third point. 276 of those authors. So I think it works out to 74.7% of the authors in the field published a single article. And that's it. And this is one of the reasons why when you look at, like, say, the handbook of research in online and blended learning, the editors actually in their preface make the comment that although most of the people doing work in the area knew each other and even occasionally worked together, many new to the field thought that they were discovering K-12 online and blended instruction for the first time. They continue, this wasn't an egotistical exercise. This wasn't another occasion where one academic was calling out peers for not including their citation or reference in a paper. Rather, this was a problem as researchers, particularly those new to the field, seeming to be lacking the opportunity to proverbially stand on the shoulders of giants. And I read that directly because it's an important thing. Those 276 authors really weren't familiar with the field. So what you're looking at there is that the vast majority of research, 3 out of every 4 people involved in it. And if you go back to the number of articles, there were 102 of those articles where it was just in a single journal and that's it. So that was a third of those articles. A significant chunk of the research really is being produced by people who may not be aware of all of this other stuff, who may not be aware of the nuances around how things are described and who's writing in the field and what research has been published. And that's an important thing because it really limits the ability for individuals to build upon things. So what ends up happening is you can have these for-profit corporations that can find one of these articles written by one or more of these 276 people here, that supports what it is they want to say. But the reason it supports what it is that they're trying to promote is simply because it was researched by someone that has no knowledge of or concept of or background in the field whatsoever. And if you're completely ignorant of the field, it's very easy to make declarations about things that may not be supported by the other research. And some people would say, and at the time this was written, which would have been 12 years ago now, this was probably true, that K-12 online learning was a new field. So some of that initial descriptive work that you see was probably a natural extension. But the reality is, we've been doing this now for 30 years. And really the only thing that we've learned is that for the most part, we don't do it well. And the last 10 months of what we've seen here, not just in the US, but worldwide, when everyone has had to shift in this, not only do we not do it well, but no one really sort of knows how to do it well. So even if we had the ability to go out and tell all these teachers, you should be doing this, this, and this, we really have no idea what those thises are at this point. When you do look at the research that's available, the vast majority of it tends to look at this comparative aspect of it, which, this evaluative aspect of it, which for the questions that Betty listed off at the beginning is actually very useful for what it is that we want to look at today. So looking at some of this, if you look at just the NEPC reports, since 2013, they've been doing annual reports. Starting in 2019, they actually switched to a biennial model. So the next report is actually going to be coming out. We submitted our first drafts about two and a half weeks ago. So I suspect that the 2021 version of the report, which will take us up to the end of the 2019-2020 school year, so take us up to essentially June of last year in terms of the data, that should come out sometime in, I'm going to guess, from late March to early May, somewhere in that roughly 8-week time period. But if you look at what we found over the years in the 7 reports that we've done already, it's been a very consistent kind of model. And Betty teased this in the quote that she ended with in her introduction. What you see here is that the full-time online programs like the cyber charters or the virtual public academies that we have in Michigan have consistently performed quite poorly. I mean, when you're looking at, national averages where student, completion rate or on-time graduation rates, in the 80%, whereas it's down in the 50 and 40% for these online programs. And it's not just us that are finding those things. While this particular table ends in 2014, we've got actually reports that go right back to 2006 that compare full-time online programs with their brick and mortar counterparts. And it's regardless if you're using a national sample or if you're focused upon individual states, and it really doesn't matter what state you're focused upon here. Every single one of them finds that students in these full-time programs perform rather poorly on average compared to their brick and mortar counterparts, either in that state or when they're matched up to try to account for all of the differences in these students. And it's not just other states. The Michigan Virtual Learning Research Institute does an effectiveness report every year. And they've been doing it since 2015. And as you can see here, and they've even in recent years gotten a little more sophisticated with how they actually present the data. So breaking it apart between those full-time programs that are operated by LEAs, which would be school districts, compared to those full-time programs that are operated as public school academies, which are your cyber charters. So you can see that for the most part, the passing rate or the completion rate in Michigan tends to be around 80%. Back in 2015, it was actually 89. But for the most part, you've seen it's just under, 80%. They're 78 for many years, 79, 76. And what we see in the full-time virtual schools, tends to be down in the 40 and 50% range. So you're looking at, just a little bit better than half as well, maybe as much as doing 2/3 as well. So it's an important thing, and one of the things that the folks in the companies, and this is a quote from, I think it was 2012 or 2013, because we don't use AYP anymore now, but essentially they were saying that using these sort of comparative models like you've seen on the last 3 slides really aren't a good measure. And they make the argument that our students come to us, and they're so far behind that, really we should be looking at a growth metric as opposed to an actual performance metric. So, if I've got a student that is here and another student that's here, and then at the end of the day, the student that was right here is now up here, whereas the student that was here has, only a little bit behind him, which one has grown more? So which program has done a better job at learning? The student that went from 20 to 70, or the student that went from 40 to 80? Right? Obviously, the one that went from 20 to 70 has a better growth metric. But when you start to actually look at this, and this, so I guess the quote comes from 2011, because the data from Colorado, which was one of the few states that actually used a growth model at the time. As you can see here, the blue dots are those that were full-time online programs. And you'll see that for the most part, if you were to sort of draw a line right in the middle there at that 50% range, and then draw a line up and down the middle, and you can kind of see there's a dotted line for the up and down one at 50%. Those that are in the bottom left-hand corner represent those schools or those students that both achieved at a lower level, but also had a lower growth level. And if you look at this, I mean, it's fascinating because with the math programs here, everybody is on the left side, or at least all the blue dots are on the left side of the chart, which means all of the blue dots are in the low growth. So even those students that performed well, so you can see like there's a small blue dot that's up here in the higher achievement. So even this one here, where the students were achieving roughly about 70% by the looks of it, their level of growth was actually still quite small. It's still over in the low growth range. And this is a consistent finding. So when you look at the reading scores, again, the majority of them are still down in this quadrant, and almost all of them are still on the lower growth side of the chart. Similarly, when you look at the writing, although this is probably the area that they do best, at least when it comes to growth, because this is the one where they're most in the middle. But as you can see, again, still most people are in that lower left quadrant. So they're performing at low levels, and they're also growing at low levels. The other argument that you'll see these folks, the proponents of the cyber charters often make, is that, we're not comparing apples to apples, that our students, this is a school of last resort for them. And we have, such poor students. And unfortunately, there's not really a good way to look at, to essentially test that hypothesis. For a number of reasons. One is because many of these programs have what we call a trial period. So you could have a lot of students that enroll in them, and then within the first 2 to 4 weeks during the trial period, when they're not considered to officially have enrolled at that point, even though they're enrolled, but essentially the program hasn't got the funding for them, these students drop out and go back into the classroom. And we don't know exactly, the reasons for that. Is it because, that they're the worst of the worst and they can't even perform in this? Did they actually think about it and have a metacognitive awareness to say, I can't do this, so I'm going to go back into the classroom? We really don't have a lot of this data, really any of this data. And because of that, these are for-profit corporations again. So these aren't necessarily things that they want to tell us. Really, the only thing we can look at is the demographics that we have here, and make some assessments or some judgments based upon the types of students that they serve. So as you can see here, you see a bunch of up and down arrows as well as a bunch of equal signs. So if you see an up arrow, that means that the online program serves a higher proportion of students with that demographic characteristic. So for example, in all the years that we've looked at this with the NEPC, all 7 years, the proportion of white students that were enrolled in full-time online programs was always much higher than what the proportion of white students in a given state was. Similarly, if you look at the minority students, with the exception of Native Americans and Pacific Islanders, where the proportion of students that were enrolled in the online programs is roughly the same proportion that was enrolled in that were the statewide averages, these programs have tended to enroll a lower proportion of minority students. They've also enrolled a lower proportion of English language learners, a lower proportion of free and reduced lunch learners, and initially would enroll a lower proportion of special ed students. Although, as you can see, that's changed over the years. So the first 3 years, they had a much lower proportion of special education students. In 2016, we weren't able to get data for it. In 2017 and 18, the proportion of special ed students was about the same. And actually in 2019, the proportion of special ed students in these full-time online programs was a couple of percentage points more than what the state average was for the states in which they operate. Now, that's not to say that any of these specific characteristics results in a specific type of student. It's just this is the only data that we have available. Now, we can make some judgment calls. Obviously, a special education student needs more support, or at least specific types of support that are outlined in their IEP. English language learners oftentimes tend to be behind their first language counterparts because language is a barrier for them. Similarly, one of the things that we know from really decades of research in the US is that socioeconomic status correlates very well with student performance. So free and reduced lunch is oftentimes how we operationalize socioeconomic status within a K-12 research study. The difficulty with all of this, and it's important to make this particular caveat. So while all of this research has found that these online programs perform poorly compared to the brick and mortar counterparts, it's important to note that the dominant view in the field is essentially that it's not the technology or the medium's fault. So it's not the fact that the instruction is online that is the reason why these students are doing so poorly. It's because it's bad instruction. Richard Clark has summed this up in what I think is probably one of the best metaphors that I've ever heard in education. Technology or media or the medium in which delivers instruction is just the vehicle that does it. And it doesn't influence student achievement any more than, the delivery truck that carries the groceries to my supermarket changes the nutritional value of the food inside of it. In both cases, they are just a delivery medium. Rick Ferdig, who's a fellow Michigander, has put it, under what conditions is the instruction or is the learning happening is what actually impacts learning. The way I've tended to coin it, it's the design, delivery, and support of the instruction that actually impacts the learning. So one of the things, we found, and as Betty teased at the beginning, these things really, over the years, it's been fairly consistent. These programs don't do well. Yet, while they don't do well, we continue to see time and time again that not only do they grow, but for the most part, legislators really don't want to do anything about that. Now part of that is just the research has been limited in many ways, and I won't get into this, but there is an article that it's an open access article that I published that looks at the maturity of the field. And one of the things I argue is that the field doesn't have a level of maturity that it should after 30 years based upon these 5 particular constructs. And if we had more time, I'd sort of go into each one, but I won't bother with that. But there's a bigger reason why policymakers basically just don't really care about a lot of this. And Michigan is actually one of the best case studies for this, because Michigan is one of the few places where by the actual state legislation, there is a Michigan Virtual Learning Research Institute, and they receive funding every single year as part of the legislation to do research on. And I don't expect you to read any of this because it's like in 6-point font. What I want to highlight is the fact that the state legislature has picked out these 19 things. And as you can see, some of these things, like item number 5 and item number 16, are quite detailed in nature. So the state legislature has said, we want to know more about these things so that we can make effective policy. And you would think that would be a great thing, but not really. Because as you saw a few minutes ago, these are, and you've seen this slide already, this is the performance of these programs in Michigan. Yet, we haven't seen really any meaningful regulation or oversight with these full-time programs, even though year after year for the last, 6 years, they've found that these programs aren't doing all that well. And actually a really good case study in this is if you look at when these full-time cyber charters were first brought back to Michigan. So in 1999, Michigan actually banned all full-time charters because of the corrupt actions of one of the for-profit providers that was operating in the state in the 2 years that they actually had these online programs. This particular one started up in September, and by February of that school year, the legislature had banned these things from existing. So that should give you a sense as to how bad things were. But in roughly a decade later, the legislature passes Public Act 205. And in 205, what they do is they lift the ban on cyber charters. And the way in which the legislation is worded, that, it allows for 2 companies to create 1 full-time program each. The companies have to be national in scope and they have to have a specific size. And lo and behold, there are only 2 companies that meet those requirements. At the time, it was Connections Academy and K-12 Inc. Connections Academy was subsequently bought out by Pearson, and K-12 Inc. was subsequently rebranded actually just this year as Stride. What they did was each school was limited to 400 students in the first year and an additional 1,000 students in the second year. And in that second year enrollment, which I thought was actually quite creative, for every regular ed student that they brought into the program, they had to bring in 1 student from the state's dropped out list, which I thought was great. So you could enroll year 2, enroll 401, but to get 402, you had to find someone that had dropped out of the system. And recapture that student, because one of the arguments these online programs made was that these programs provide an opportunity for folks to have a second chance at an education. So they were essentially making them put their money where their mouth was with that particular requirement. At the end of these first 2 years, the Department of Ed was going to sit down, look at how the programs did, and then decide about how much they could grow in years 3, 4, and however, based upon how they did in those first 2 years. So when you look at how they did in those first 2 years, so you had the Michigan Connections Academy and the Michigan Virtual Cyber Academy. The Michigan Connections Academy obviously is the Connections Academy one, and the Michigan Virtual Cyber Academy was the K-12 Inc. one. And you can see the statewide benchmarks that we had for the MEPs in those 2 years for all of those categories. And you can see how each of the programs did. And you can see the amount of red on that chart there. And those red areas are areas where the school is performing below the statewide average. And just to point out, if you look at like the Michigan Virtual Cyber Academy in their second year of operation, of all of the areas that were tested, they only actually made the state average in 2 of those, roughly 12.5 areas that we've got there. Every single other one that's there, they actually had failed in. And this is a good example of, why we see this kind of finding year after year in the NEPC report. So this is, again, the last 5 years of the NEPC report that we've had the legislative analysis that looks at how much legislative activity is happening. And as you can see, there's tends to be a fair amount of a drop in the number of bills. And, the line there, I think you see there's in the middle one, we find little evidence to indicate that legislative activity or actions are being informed by the emerging research on virtual schools. And that was the actual case in Michigan, because in the spring of 2010, literally only months before the department was going to review the data that I just showed you, the legislature decided that they were going to pass Senate Bill 619, which removed the cap on the number of virtual schools that could exist, and then limited their enrollment. And you can see the numbers that are there. And since even still to this day, there aren't any virtual schools that are topping that 10,000 mark, obviously those things were meaningless restrictions that they put in. So even before they could put in this analysis, the politicians basically decided, to hell with that. We're going to pass this and help our corporate buddies and really provide them with no meaningful restrictions whatsoever. And one of the problems that we have with this is because it is a political process. And, there's a lot of reasons why this happens. But, as you can see from this chart here, you've got a really sort of convoluted, incestuous way in which these companies really try to influence the process, the bill making, the policy making process that we have in each of these states, from, donating directly to politicians during elections, to the lobbying that they do, to the money that they spend on these advocacy organizations, including most of the parent and student advocacy groups in your state. So when you see, the Michigan Parents for Choice, or whatever the label that they have on their school choice parent advocacy group is in the state, chances are, when I say chances are, I mean there's a 90% chance that that group is largely funded by the companies that are offering school choice initiatives, to the point that many of them fund, and in the case of both Connections and K-12 Inc., sit on the committees of the American Legislative Exchange Council, which author model bills that then get sent out to the individual states for passage in their legislature. So each of the committees at ALEC is chaired by one politician and one corporate person. And the Education Committee has in recent year, well, really for the last decade, been chaired by either someone from Connections or someone from K-12 Inc. So they're having essentially direct influence in the bills that they pass. And it's interesting because when you look at the numbers, these are the school district sizes as of roughly 5 years ago. So you can see I put the top 25 in the country up there. Now, none of them are in Michigan. You can see the largest one at the time had about 1 million. To be in the top 25, you had to have 111,000. Now, K-12 Inc. has roughly, as of their last SEC filing, so their last filing to the Securities Exchange Council, they said that they have 118,591 students, which if they were a school district would put them basically at number 22. So they would come in right after San Diego Unified in terms of the number of size, and that's nationwide. But if they were a school district, they would basically roughly be there at approximately 118,500. These are the corporate salaries for the folks that are running K-12 Inc. right now. So the direct cash salary for the CEO and chairman was almost $3 million in their most recent filing. How many superintendents do you know in the US that make $3 million? Do any of them even make $1 million? I know in my looking through, the best one I could see was some of the New York states actually paid $500,000. I know Cobb County, which was down near the bottom of the list, but was one of the more affluent states at the bottom of the list. You can see they're number 23 with 113,000. So about the same size as K-12 Inc. And they're a very affluent county in terms of their funding. Their superintendent gets about 375,000. But these are just the top 5 salaries at K-12 Inc. So, and it's funny, and I'll sort of end on this. It's really interesting when even the folks that are behind charter schools in general start to basically say that, well, we want to distance ourselves from this type of charter school, and this type of charter school being full-time virtual charter schools. So in a 2016 report, the National Alliance for Public Charter Schools, the 50-state Campaign for Achievement Now, and the National Association of Charter School Authorizers basically started to call on legislators and policymakers to really start to crack down on these, not just policymakers, but the individual authorizers within each state. And they made 6 recommendations. And again, I won't go into these. You'll be able to see them in the recording or in the slides, which I'll post on my website. And but they're all basically looking around at how do we limit things? How do we limit the growth? How do we provide additional oversight? And then how do we decrease the amount of funding or money that goes to these? Because there's obviously a strong profit motive that you see in this particular model. So I know that's a little longer than I want it to go, and I apologize about that, but I don't mind hanging out for a little bit past the top of the hour if folks have additional questions. And I will just put that slide up so folks can take a quick screenshot while Betty and company start to facilitate the Q&A process.
Anyone who has questions can put them up on the Q&A or chat and I'll see them, but otherwise the committee came up with some questions. So how would you recommend that the league think about within the state changing policy of having up to 10,000 students in schools that are not functioning?
Well, I mean, the first thing I would suggest is that the Michigan Virtual Learning Research Institute has actually provided a lot of direction in terms of, some of the things that could be done, or at least some of the areas that are working and aren't working. As an example, with the supplemental programs, one of the things that they report is about 75% of all schools in Michigan report that 100% of their supplemental online students successfully complete a course. So 75% of the schools throughout the state of Michigan are doing something right with supplemental learning. But yet that's not a story that you hear about throughout the state. That's not something that you hear state legislatures pushing and saying, okay, well, we need to, try to figure out what's happening here. And then how do we promote more of that from happening? Because there's a lot of good things that are happening right now. From a standard base level, one of the things I'd suggest, and it's not just true of the cyber schools, I would suggest it's true of this full school choice movement. When you allow for-profit corporations to directly or indirectly run schools, the main thinking goes around bottom line thinking as opposed to what's best for the student. Essentially, each student is a widget. And the way in which corporations make money is you maximize profit per widget. And when you look at this idea of these for-profit program or for-profit companies running schools, what that means is in most situations, the principal isn't an employee of the school or even the board that authorizes the board that manages the school or even the authorizer. The principal, all of the teachers, all of the staff are employees of the corporation. They're not employees of the school. The corporation basically is given a contract to manage all aspects of the school and then given 90% or higher of the FTE to do that. And that's really the oversight that gets provided. And the board that is supposed to provide that oversight, which is often handpicked by the corporation themselves. And that's actually something you've seen in Pennsylvania. Authorizers have started to stop authorizing virtual schools where they don't believe there is true independence between the board and the company that they're hiring. Although with the number of authorizers that you have in Michigan and the different types of authorizers, that might be difficult. One of the things that the National Alliance for Charter Schools recommended that I think also plays into this in Michigan is the amount of the FTE that the authorizer can have. Because if you're a charter school authorizer, and when I was with the Michigan Connections Academy, we were authorized by Fair State. Fair State got 3% of every FTE we brought in.
Still get 3%.
Yeah,
all
so,
authorizers get 3%.
There's really little incentive for an authorizer to crack down on these programs because they tend to be, particularly the cyber ones, because they have such high enrollments, tend to be real moneymakers for them. So there's a lot of things that have already been put out into the research base, many of which have actually been put out by the Michigan Virtual Learning Research Institute that I think are good starting points. I see there's something coming in on the Q&A there. I'd been watching it while we were going.
Yeah, she asks for, thanks for your detailed attention to Michigan. Her question is, what one thing would you most suggest we start with to try to change Michigan?
Well, the thing that would obviously have the biggest impact is that removing the for-profit corporation from the equation. Realistically, that's not probably a realistic goal.
Because we have for-profit in the entire charter.
Yes, yeah. And that's why I don't think it's a realistic thing. If it was only happening in the virtual setting, it might be easier. But because the vast majority of charter schools in general, I mean, really the whole school choice movement is propped up by private and for-profit interest. But that would be the one thing that could make the biggest difference. The one thing that's probably easiest to accomplish, only because it's been done in other jurisdictions, is to tie the funding to student performance in some way. So you have jurisdictions, for example, like Florida, where the school district doesn't, or the provider of the online program doesn't get any funding if the student doesn't complete the course. So there's a real financial incentive for these programs to, and not just the full-time programs, in their case, it's supplemental ones as well. There's a real incentive for them to do everything they can in order for the students to have success. If an all or nothing model is not a good one, in the, I think it was late 2000s, there was a bill that went through the Arizona legislature, interestingly passed by the Republican House, passed by the Republican Senate, but then vetoed by the Republican governor, where they tied the funding to milestones. So on count day, with the students that were still enrolled by count day, you got like 20% of the funding for them. And then once they had completed 50% of the course, or, I'm making up the percentages here now, by whatever's in the LMS, they got another 30%. And when they completed all of the course in the system, they might get another 40%. And then when they took the statewide assessment, if there was one for that particular subject area at the end of the year, they got the final 10%. So they had these specific, and what those milestones are and how much you give at each time. I would leave up to policymakers to make informed decisions about, but it moves away from this all or nothing thing. And I think that's an achievable one because it's happened in other places. And it's also one that I think would have a big impact, because if you tie money to performance as opposed to money to enrollment, it's going to force these programs to actually try to do something about performance.
In Michigan, that's going to be a big thing, since 90% of our funding comes from the September count.
Yes. And I mean, even just that one thing is how that count day is defined for online programs. And I can't remember off the top of my head what that means in Michigan. I know when the first day or the first 2 years when I was involved with when I was vice president of the board for the Michigan Connections Academy, and I will say, while I am very critical of these programs, hats off to Connections Academy, or at least Connections Academy 10 years ago, because I was saying these things about these programs and saying they shouldn't exist at all 10 years ago. And yet Connections Academy still put me on the board of one of their programs. So they weren't worried about a little bit of criticism on that front. But I mean, count day at that point in time for an online program was based upon who logged in on count day. Right. So, much the same way that who shows up at the school on September 30th, and is that real? I mean, well, you saw the schedule that the connector, the K-12 folks put up there, depending upon what day it is, there's lots of days where there might be a lot of asynchronous stuff that they're doing. There might be, a lot of offline things that they're doing depending on the grade level. Just because they didn't log in that day doesn't necessarily mean they weren't engaged in their schooling if you're doing it based on a one-day count. So you see some states have even gone to looking at they have to have spent X amount of time in the system over the 5 days leading up to count day as a way of measuring what is attendance for count day. But yes, that kind of funding arrangement, I think, is one of the big issues.
Well, I think we know that we've gone past 1 o'clock. We thank you very much. I have a whole slew of questions, but I will ask you those unless there are any other committee members or people who have questions. I think we generally draw these to a close after an hour. Thank you very much, Dr. Barbour. I think you've given us a lot of ideas, and if you don't mind, we would love to have the slides.
Yep, I will.
I do recommend all league members that the National Education Policy Center report for Virtual Schools 2019 is very much online, and the committee has read through the first 2 chapters and discussed them together, and is working on the 3rd one. So
I can tell you that all of my scholarship, every presentation I've ever done or any paper I've ever published is all available on my website. So even if it isn't an open source document, I've gotten permission from the authors or the editors to either post preprint items or the actual items. So anything that I've ever authored or said is available off of my website there, and as will these slides. And I'll send a copy to you as well so that you can post them on your channels too.
Right. Thank you very much, and thank you all league members for attending today. We hope this has been informative. The Education Committee welcomes any new members who want to join us and discuss this in more depth. Thank you so much, Michael, for becoming our expert and for attending today.
My pleasure.